The following program is presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.
Then there's that colorful character, Devereaux by name, whose life is a bit too complex to sketch in here. Such a strange mixture of the good and the bad.
KTCA TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis, presents Ireland Rediscovered, a series of 13 programs dealing with the significance of the Irish nation which has emerged to statehood in our own times. Dr. John McKiernan, head of the Department of English at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul and an authority on Ireland, is host and lecturer. The title of this program is The Irish of the Southern Cross. Here again is Professor McKiernan.
America. Even the very name of these continents, the North and the South, even the very name itself is foreign. That the populations were foreign, that these populations were composed of immigrants, this we know. But the name itself is also a constant reminder of our indebtedness to Europe, Asia, and Africa. In the last program, we talked about the part that the Irish, as immigrants, had played in the building of the Northern Colossus. In this program, we turn our attention to that unknown continent, to the southern hemisphere, to South America. And although it is true that this continent was dominated particularly by two European nations, Portugal and Spain, we do find that other immigrants also aided in the development, the discovery, the expansion of this continent. And so, I should like then to tell you of the part played by the Irish in the building of South America. It is extraordinary to think that they were there from the time of Shakespeare. Not that Shakespeare was a South American or a Spaniard. But from the 16th century, we find that the Irish were present. And we might well ask ourselves, what is the explanation for the ubiquity, if you will, the omnipresence of the Irish? We find that answer in a situation which is understandable to us today. The Irish are the classic example of the displaced peoples, the refugees of another time. As they were compelled from one reason or another, chiefly political, to leave their homes, they had to look elsewhere for the opportunities that were no longer permitted them at home. It was neither safe nor opportune for many of them to remain in Ireland. Thus we find that particularly from the 17th century on, as the Irish power, as the Irish civilization, as the Irish state crumbled before successful English attack, we find that a pattern begins to emerge, a pattern of immigration, which has remained constant to this day. As the Irish left in the early 17th century, they turned in great numbers to Spain, who was, you will remember at that time, England's mortal enemy. A pattern emerged then of Irish immigration to a continent, to a country on the continent, a country that was familiar to them through previous trading, a country with whom they shared a religion, and a country who, with them, seemed to have a common enemy. So it was that the Irish found themselves in Spain, and quite naturally, I suppose, found themselves in South America, since South America was Hispanic America. It's extraordinary, really, to quote even a short list of the number of Irish who distinguished themselves in Latin America, in Hispanic America. No matter how short the list, it is impressive. We have, for instance, Juan O'Donoghue, one of the ablest of the viceroys of Mexico. Colonel Juan McKenna, a one-time governor of Valparaiso and a hero of the War of Chilean independence. General Francis O'Connor, a commander in the Bolivian Legion of Honor. Ambrosio O'Higgins, Viceroy of Peru before the liberation, and his son, Bernardo O'Higgins, the liberator of Chile. Daniel Florence O'Leary, the chief aide to Simon Bolivar, and also Bolivar's Boswell. General Thomond O'Brien, personal aide to that great man San Martin. And O'Brien is remembered also as the man who opened the Andes to commerce and who served abroad as a representative of Uruguay. Then there's that colorful character, Devereux, the founder of the Irish Legion, a man who at one time was called the Lafayette of South America, but a man whose life is so complex I could hardly sketch it here briefly. A strange combination of good and bad. And yet, he lies today in the National Pantheon in Caracas. Now, while listing Irishmen of such distinction, a very interesting and curious fact emerges. For some strange reason, the Irish have had a most interesting association with navies, the navies of both North America and South America. Many of you, I am sure, are familiar with the name of Commodore John Barry, who is often called the father of the American Navy, the United States Navy, that is. This same paternity of navies existed south of the Panama Canal, where, for instance, Thomas Charles Wright from Drogheda in Ireland became the founder of the Navy of Ecuador and its first commander-in-chief, where Bernardo O'Higgins became the founder of the Navy of Chile. And interestingly, the first two ships of Chile were captained by Irish-born. And for instance, William Brown, about whom you will hear later, the founder of the Argentine Navy. Now, this list could be lengthened, but lists in themselves don't always tell us enough, don't always tell us the important facts, because there are many people in the world like you and me who shine with no particular distinction, and yet we serve our part. And so it is true that this list does not enumerate the thousands of Irish, particularly in Argentina, who served in their patient, loyal way to assist in the development of those countries. So from the short list that I have just enumerated, I should like to select two names for the sheer historical drama and for the glory with which these names were embellished by their owners. I should like to select the names of William Brown and the two names of the O'Higginses, Ambrosio the father and Bernardo the son. First then, let me tell you the story of William Brown from County Mayo. His parents immigrated to America in 1786. The father unfortunately died very shortly after their arrival in America. And as a young lad of 11, he found it necessary to ship to sea as a cabin boy. And then he had the most extraordinary experience after that of being taken off that ship by an English ship of war and being impressed into English service. Now, this experience, rough indeed as it was, he grafted on to a great native ability, to an imagination which even in his youth seemed bold and daring. He profited, in other words, from what might, with another man, have been a great misfortune. And eventually, his experience over, and now with a taste of the sea in his blood, he acquired command of a British merchant ship. He married, he came to know the responsibilities of the world, and looking about in England, he felt that an Irishman might do better elsewhere. So, with the hope of making a fortune, he decided to take himself into the South American service. And as early as 1812, found himself in Buenos Aires. Before very long, with his experience, with his imagination, with a great deal of energy, he determined that a packet service between Buenos Aires and Montevideo might be something that would be the making of his fortune. And so he initiated this service. Now, these two places were Buenos Aires, Montevideo, not terribly far apart, but both of them having access to the sea, and both of them commercial rivals. By the institution of this packet service, he supplied Buenos Aires with the beginnings of its ocean trade, and he also, of course, was instituting his own fortune. And unknown to himself, he was laying the foundation for his entire career. Because it wasn't long before Spain and Buenos Aires found themselves, shall we say, having differences of opinion. In February 1814, less than 2 years after his arrival, he aligned himself with the rebel, with the insurgent forces in Buenos Aires, and collecting 7 ships, not all of them indeed very sturdy, and with a great deal of daring, and with a tremendous insight into the military values of the situation, he sailed to the island fort of Martin Garcia and was successful in wresting it from Spanish control. With these 7 ships, augmented now by a captured ship or 2, he engaged Spanish vessels at other points on the La Plata River, on and off the coastal regions of Argentina and Uruguay. He had several spectacular victories, and when he sailed back to Buenos Aires, this Irishman was made admiral of the Navy, which he had ushered into being. Now, this victory, or these several victories, but this particular victory of his, of capturing the fort, stirred the imaginations of the rebels. And this was a period when Spain was having its problems on the continent of Europe, and it was a period when the colonies of Spain in South America were feeling the desire to free themselves from the mother country. The whole continent then, we might say, was aflame. There was talk of rebellion here, the talk of a victory here, and all told, that huge continent burned with the talk of victory. Brown took his infant navy and sailed down the coast of Argentina, around Cape Horn, and up the coast of Chile, almost 3,000 miles in length, up to Peru, Colombia, that whole western coast of South America. He terrorized, if you will, not the coast, but Spanish shipping. He sailed as far north as El Callao, Guayaquil. He menaced Spanish shipping. He had no great victories. His forces were too small. But the mere fact that he did this was in itself a great enspiriting of the rebellion. All over, the insurgents cheered the daring of Argentina, cheered the threat that this meant to Spanish arms, cheered the hope that it gave them. Well, eventually, Argentina was successful against Spain, as indeed we know that all the republics were. And unfortunately, freedom often brings disagreements of its own. And shortly after the liberation from Spain, Argentina now found itself at war with its huge nation to the north, the nation of Brazil. And again, Brown was recalled to active service. And with extraordinary vigor and with a large reach of the imagination, he broke a superior blockade, a blockade of superior force that had been operative against Buenos Aires. He broke this, and not only broke it, but again raided the coasts, this time the east coast, the coast of Brazil. He raided indeed as far north as Rio de Janeiro. And in 1827, with only 7 ships of his own and 8 one-gun launches, he destroyed a larger fleet of 17 war vessels. Indeed, they tell a very interesting story of this man, Brown. At one time, his ship was visited by the head of the Argentine government, Don Manuel de Rosas, who visited as an honor the ship of his great admiral. Brown offered him a seat at the dinner table, a seat below Brown. He could see the scandalized expressions of his officers, and one of them leaned over and whispered to Brown that after all, the head of the state should have the place of honor at the head of the table. And Brown sternly rebuked him. Whatever position de Rosas held on land, he reminded his officer, he, Brown, was the head of that ship. Well, this might be, I suppose, an indication of Irish independence, of which Brown had plenty. But he was a man who was appreciated, and not only for his services, but also for his personal qualities. After the war with Brazil had been concluded, Brown returned to his estate near Buenos Aires, where he spent the rest of his life. He died there on May 3rd, 1857, having once before that visited the land of his birth. The country of Argentina, for which he had sacrificed so much, erected a monument to him with an inscription in his own language, in Irish, that is. And this inscription and monument are to be seen today near the government buildings on Admiral Brown Avenue in Buenos Aires. I should like to read to you the words of the funeral oration. This oration was made by one of the leading historians of Argentina, a man who later became its president. And he had this to say of Brown: "The Argentinian Navy is now bereft of the venerable father who presided at its birth in the stormy bosom of the River Plata. The Pacific, the Atlantic, the Uruguay, the Paraná, the River Plata will always be immortal pages on which men may read of his heroic deeds. And while the smallest skiff floats upon these waters, and while there floats above it the flag of Argentina, the name of Admiral Brown will always be invoked as the guardian spirit of our seas." So much for an immortal Irishman. But I should like to tell you now of two other Irish, at least one Irish born and one half Irish, of Irish fatherhood. I should like to tell you of the father, Ambrosio O'Higgins, and the son, Bernardo O'Higgins. These men provide, I think, one of the greatest dramas, one of the greatest ironies, if you will, of South American history. The father built for Spain. The son tore down what the father built, that Chile might live in its own right. The greatest tribute that we could pay to Ambrosio O'Higgins is to say that the Spanish king honored him with the highest office that it could confer upon anyone, and honored him, who was not a Spaniard, with an office that hitherto had been reserved only for Spanish nobility. That is, he was made Viceroy of Peru, the highest colonial post in Spanish America. I'll read to you a brief description by a Chilean writer. Speaking of O'Higgins Sr., O'Higgins the father, it was written, "He was of medium stature, but stout. His face was round, his nose was regular. He had brown eyes with thick eyebrows and a ruddy complexion, for which reason he was called the shrimp in Chile. He was affable, tactful, and courteous, but upright and just. He was constant in his friendships, determined, courageous and reliable, and very active in undertaking works for the public benefit. He was a zealous royalist and greatly devoted to the Spanish rule." This is remarkable, that Chileans today should remember the man who was greatly devoted to Spanish rule. But they honor in Ambrosio the devotion to the good of the people of the country, a good and a devotion which has seldom been surpassed. The book is filled with it. I could read to you from this and from many other books of the great man, Ambrosio. But I should like to tell you something too about the son. The son was born in Chillán, out of wedlock, unfortunately, because his father was too high a noble in Spanish eyes to be permitted to marry a Chilean woman, no matter how high her origins. Well, the son, therefore, had to be hidden. He was shunted about from school in Chile to Peru to Spain to England. In England, the secret of the paternity was kept, but in England he met a man, Francisco de Miranda, the precursor of South American freedom. And this great Miranda was the, shall we say, the undoing or the doing of the young Bernardo. Bernardo caught from him the spirit of freedom. Bernardo at this time was about 20. It was 1798. Freedom was in the air. The American Revolution was over. The French Revolution. There was revolution in Ireland at the moment. Bernardo lived and breathed revolution from Miranda. He went home, back to Chile, and now began the undoing of all that the father had done. Strange and most extraordinary, and we wonder about the great drama hidden in the hearts of these men. He, shall we say, organized his forces secretly, but he was faced, of course, with operating under extraordinary difficulties. Eventually, the command of the rebel forces was given over to him, but not without incurring the jealousy of a native Chilean, a Carrera by name. And I should tell you the extraordinarily difficult tale of a great battle. A battle here when O'Higgins was in command of the native forces, the Battle of Rancagua. Here you see an outline of the fortification. These squares are streets, and you can see how hastily these fortifications were thrown up. Behind these lines, O'Higgins and 500 men fought off a Spanish army of 5,000. But it was hopeless. Carrera, the man who had been deposed in favor of O'Higgins, was 20 miles away. And O'Higgins sent a messenger who got through the lines, begging Carrera for his help. Carrera, to make the story short, did not come. And after 50 hours of fighting, with no water, with no rest, O'Higgins knew there was no hope for success. And he and a group of his men broke through the lines and rode to Santiago, 50 miles away. From here he went to Argentina, where he met San Martin, the great Argentinian patriot. And with San Martin and 5,000 men, he recrossed the Andes, San Martin and O'Higgins, and 5,000 men, fighting their way over snowy passes for 18 days, marching, performing a feat which was not equaled by anything in the American War of Independence, not equaled indeed by Hannibal's march across the Alps, one of the greatest feats in human heroism. Well, these are the stories, if you will, of great Irish. Irish who gave their all to the countries of their adoption. You know, the Irish are remarkably like the Jews, forced into exile, walking the face of the earth. They brought with them gifts. They did not come empty-handed. And perhaps one of the most remarkable of their gifts was a burning desire for freedom and independence. In the last program, we told you how that gift functioned for the good of the United States of America. Now we have told you how that functioned for the good of the South American republics.
Ireland Rediscovered is produced by KTCA TV, Twin Cities Area Educational Television Corporation. The next title in this series is The Walking Europe. Host and lecturer is Dr. John McKiernan. Ireland Rediscovered is directed by Carl Brookins and produced by Joseph McDermott. This program was presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.